This is an interesting case study about a building on the beach. Well, at least that's what the artist wants us to believe. I'm also going to show you a technique for measuring distance directly on the watercolor, specifically the distance between the artist and that building. And I'm going to use that calculated distance to determine the exact location of the artist when he sketched this watercolor. This case study is of a watercolor by David Cox titled Figures on the Beach near Rye, Sussex, and dated about 1830. Rye is a town on the southern coast of England. It is the town that you see in the distance in this watercolor. And on the right you see a building. And the identity of this building is somewhat of a mystery, which is one of the reasons why I chose to research this watercolor. So what might be the identity of this building on the beach? On this map you see the town of Rye at the very top toward the right. Close to it we see a blue dot that marks the location of what is called Martello Tower number 30. A Martello Tower is a small fortress, and it was built in the early 19th century. Close to the harbor is another blue dot that marks the location of Martello Tower number 28, and it is over 8,000 feet from Rye. And the yellow dot marks the location of Camber Castle, built in medieval times, and it is a little over 6,000 feet from Rye. We're going to only consider two of these three as possibilities. We're going to exclude the Martello Tower number 28, mostly because of its distance, but also because it doesn't really look much like what we see in the watercolor. So let's first look at Martello Tower number 30. What you see here are two photographs of Martello Tower, one from the side and one from above, and you see the enlarged image of the building on the beach in the upper right. I think you can see that Martello Tower doesn't look much like this building, except maybe the central core of the building, that one tower at the very center. Martello Tower is about 40 feet wide and 40 feet tall. It is not surrounded by a wall, but it is surrounded by a moat, which you can see looks like a ditch that encircles it, and it is also sitting on a slight hill, and you can see that in the photograph on the lower left. It would be easy to exclude Martello Tower number 30 because it doesn't look anything really like what we see in the watercolor. But we're not going to exclude it, at least not yet, because we're going to calculate some distances first. We're going to calculate the distance between the artist and that central tower, and also the distance between the artist and a church in the center of Rye called St. Mary's Parish. Now, if we assume that that central tower is Martello Tower number 30, then we know its height, which is 40 feet. We also know the height of St. Mary's Parish, which is 140 feet, because Rye sits on a hill about 40 feet tall, and the tower itself is about 100 feet tall. Now you also need to measure their apparent heights, which is their heights as they appear to you, and you do this in PowerPoint by pasting an image of the watercolor in PowerPoint and drawing these lines, the yellow line at the tower and the green line at the church, and then you measure them. And in this case, they're measured in inches. The church measures at 0.32 inches, and that line at the tower measures at 0.24 inches. These four values are plugged into an equation. The apparent height of the tower divided by that of the church times the actual height of the church divided by that of the tower equals the distance of the church divided by the distance of the tower, and these distances are from the artist's location. The calculated value equals 2.625, which means that the artist is 2.625 times further from the church than he is from the tower. But where does that place the artist? It places him somewhere along a circle, and that circle surrounds the closest object, the tower. And we calculate that circle using a program, and this is the program. It's actually an Excel spreadsheet. A link to that spreadsheet, a downloadable version of that spreadsheet, is in the description. Let me show you what we have. At the top we have a set of instructions that are color-coded and numbered, and they match the colors and numbers on the control button to the right. One of these buttons hides or unhides the instructions. The very first thing that you're going to do is to calibrate the spreadsheet, and push the button that says calibration 1, and you align the corner with one of these red plus signs, which is what I'm doing here. And then you go up to calibration 2 and you press that, and it'll ask you if it's selected, and you say yes. Now it's calibrated. The next thing you're going to do is to paste an image of the Google Earth image of the area, that's a study area that has both in this case, the church and the tower. I'm going to register this map so that the church, the furthest object, sits directly over that red plus sign. And to do this, I have to make it semi-transparent so that I can see both. And then I'm going to insert a line between the church and the tower. And once I insert that line, I'm going to go back up to the control buttons, and I'm going to select the color on this drop-down table. I'm going to choose white, and I'm going to press this control button, which will color that line and calculate its dimensions, which it enters here. It does it for you. There's the line. And then we input that ratio value that we just calculated. And the next thing we need to do is to tell the program where these two buildings are relative to each other. So let's look at the map. And the closest building, which is the tower, is below and to the right of the furthest building on this map. So that's what I'm going to select on this pull-down menu, below to the right. And now I'm going to plot the circle, and it'll also be in white because I have not changed the color. And there's the circle. Now I'm going to group, with this button here, I'm going to group all of the map and the circle and the line so that I can copy it and paste it wherever I choose, and where I'm going to paste it is right here. Now the artist can't be just anywhere on the circle because he's looking straight ahead at the tower toward his right and at the church toward his left. So he must be somewhere on the lower left quadrant of this circle. So the next step is to go into Google Earth Studio and try to find a location that aligns with the watercolor image. And one of those locations that aligns very well is marked here with the yellow circle. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to show you what that location looks like in Google Earth Studio, and we're going to compare it with what we see in the watercolor. So here we have an image of the watercolor, and you can see the lines representing the heights, so the apparent heights of both the tower and the church. I'm going to overlay the best alignment on top of this and fade it in, and what you'll see is that there's no buildings and no towers. In this area, Google Earth is flat, which means there's nothing that rises up above the ground. You can see the topography, but that's about it. Now, I think you can see on this Google Earth image that the area underneath the tower is somewhat raised, somewhat elevated. I'm going to draw a line around that elevated area. And what that is the moat. The semicircular moat that you see surrounding the tower. Now I'm going to fade out this Google Earth image, but I'm going to leave that line that's surrounding the tower in. And what you can see is that on the watercolor, it seems to outline a region of a slightly different, perhaps darker color, and it also looks somewhat elevated. This is consistent with what we saw in the Google Earth image, which means it's consistent with the likelihood that Cox was standing at that location marked with an X when he sketched this landscape. So is this building on the beach Martello Tower number 30? Earlier we said that there was no resemblance except maybe the central tower. What I'm pointing to here is what appears to be a flagpole on that central tower. And on the right is a watercolor by David Cox that is in the Manchester Art Gallery that is titled Marine View with Martello Tower, though it is not this Martello Tower. And it also appears to have a flagpole. The image on the bottom is of an unknown artist's impression of two garrisoned Martello Towers on the Kent coast, and both are flying flags. So one possibility is that David Cox was standing near Martello Tower number 30 when he sketched this landscape, and that this central tower is of Martello Tower number 30. But what is the rest of the building? Before we make any determination, let's first take a look at Camber Castle. And though it is highly unlikely that Cox was anywhere near Camber Castle when he sketched this landscape because it is just too far, there's a remarkable resemblance between what we see in the watercolor and Camber Castle. On the left is a sketch by Turner titled Camber Castle with a Boat Aground, dated 1806 to 1810. It's in the collection of the Tate. On the right is a photograph. There is obviously a very strong resemblance between the building we see in the watercolor and Turner's sketch of Camber Castle. So how do we interpret this? I'll give you my interpretation. I believe that Cox was standing near Martello Tower number 30 when he sketched this landscape, and that the central tower in that building on the right is Martello Tower number 30. But then he changed the look of this building, perhaps influenced by Turner. He made it look much more like Camber Castle. So we'll call it Camber Castle even though it's not, and we'll call this the beach even though it's not.